far end of that yard, at the top of the hill in the ravine. So it's a nice, cool space that catches a breeze. But members of the enslaved community are interacting in that space and are coming to it from different backgrounds. So we have field hands, enslaved cooks, and domestics, all members of the enslaved community, all individuals with their own personal experiences coming to contact with this building through different routes, and also with their own personal experiences and roles in that space that are going to influence their reading of the structure. And that's sort of, this talk is geared towards interpreting or speculating with evidence how that building is going to be read in the context of their labor roles in that space. So I just wanted to backtrack and mention those things that I kind of skipped over last time. All right. So as many of you, I'm sure, are aware with the national conversation right now about the legacies of racism and legacies of slavery, plantations and monuments and stuff like that, anti-racism or anti-racist ideas have become sort of more common in our language. And I definitely owe a lot to Terry for sort of introducing me to those ideas when I was writing this. And I was at the time also reading about decolonial or decolonizing our theory and practices in archaeology. And these ideas aren't necessarily new. Archaeologist, last name Agni Davis, she talks about aligning our methodology with our theory, because archaeologists have talked a lot about, moving past racist ideas and the way we interpret spaces. And we don't always do that methodologically, or we try to, and we don't necessarily do that great of a job of it, because it's hard. It's hard to do. And this project, I think, highlights at least a component of why that can be hard, especially when it comes to spaces like I talked about last time that don't have a lot of archaeological data in terms of artifacts that are telling us exactly how the enslaved individuals felt about the structure. We don't have an artifact that correlates with a single enslaved individual that tells us, yes, this is how they read the temple. We don't even have a document that specifically tells us how they felt about the temple or temples in general. But that doesn't mean there is no information out there. So there has been some talk about, this is discussing like interpretive theory and stuff, but that speculation, especially when it is data-based, has a place in both museums and archaeological and historical theory, in the way that we approach communities that their voice isn't well represented in the record. And in this case, what the predominance of our documentary record is from the Madisons or other elites, and therefore past interpretations of the symbolism that was intended in the temple were focused solely on those components. So like, European Enlightenment ideals, and I'm going to talk about those today as well, but that's not the primary focus. The focus is on the enslaved community. So, all right, a couple sort of caveats before I go. I know this is all super riveting stuff here, and feel free to stop me and ask any questions about it. But when I mentioned the anti-racist practice, and I guess I should sort of counter that with what would be considered a racist interpretation, or something that isn't necessarily anti-racist. Here would be, as we discussed last time, not exploring the labor or experience of the enslaved within what we would assume to be a white space. But for today, doing things like assuming the enslaved did not read or understand Western symbols or ideas, that there's a tendency to oversimplify and reduce all possible interpretations amongst enslaved communities to some root cultural practice in Africa, that all of their ideas are just going to be reproductions of rituals or cultural symbols from Africa, that there is no potential for them to interpret Western ideas or mix the two or invent new ideas that are independent of the intended meanings of Western white elites and men. So, and then I kind of already addressed this, interpreting the enslaved community as a monolith. So for us, there are lots of individuals on the plantation, and even though I'm going to talk about different ideas today of possible intended or possible readings, we can't put that on every single enslaved person on the plantation by any means. And some of them may not have held true. None of them may be true, but I hope I did a good job doing my contextual research, historical, that at least they are plausible, very plausible ideas that were popular at the time, and that Montpelier is no isolated place, and that the ideas that are being engaged with are common here at Montpelier. Sorry, I'm clicking weird. All right. Any questions before I get really into move past the theory stuff? No? Okay, cool. All right, so as I mentioned, garden follies. Temples are a type of garden folly. There have been some people in the past at Montpelier who interpreted it as not being symbolic of anything. It's just an aesthetic form that was common at the time. And it's really nothing more than signifying your wealth and that you are aware of common trends. So the ones I've pictured here are notable, or, this is by no means extensive because there's a ton of them, but the temple at Montpelier is a type of garden folly and a type of temple called a monopteros, or a monopteral temple. That is a domed structure that's supported by pillars and it's open in the middle. There are other types which I will show today that are called thoros, and they also have a central chamber inside of the temple, the colonnade. And you see those a lot in our architecture, like our federal architecture. So there's examples in France, there's examples in England. We know the American elite were very influenced in both art and ideas and architecture and philosophy by their sort of Enlightenment era counterparts back in Europe. So the sort of rise in this style of temple happens a little bit earlier in England, as a lot of things do, and France, and make their way over. And it tends to be on, the estates of the ultra wealthy, aristocrats. There have been some people well, I'm getting ahead of myself there, but they might have some other sort of meanings too. Jefferson is often attributed as being one of the major people who brings over this style of architecture, which is called Palladian architecture. This is actually a sketch that Jefferson drew of a possible, he was always drawing possible garden follies that he wanted to put on his various properties. And we don't know if this was drawn to be shown to Madison as an influence, because it's done a couple years before the design and the construction of the temple begins at Montpelier. So we don't know if they were conversing and Jefferson was like, hey, I found this cool building form, you should build it. You'll be cool and hip like those people in France. Or, we're not really sure if he was considering also building a structure like that, because we also have examples like this, which was never built. It was a garden folly tower that he wanted to build at his property in Mont Alto. He had some other designs that were basically, if you all are familiar with the common willow pattern that we find a lot on transferwares. He had a garden folly that was a rip right off of a garden folly that appears on those that he wanted to build at Montalto too. So he was always doing this kind of stuff. But you'll notice there is a temple type structure-ish on the top there. There are others who were involved with the construction of the temple at Montpelier more directly, at least in design. So you have William Thornton and Anna Thornton. So this was on the left here, you have a early design for the temple, or for the US Capitol, that has a giant monopteral temple on top of it. Obviously that wasn't done, but it was sort of a prototype. And then another plantation from the same era in which the temple is built at Montpelier that has this half portico, half monopteral temple portico on the front. And Thornton was very involved with both plantation and federal architecture influence. So there's other people like Peel, who was a artist and architect, and like all of them, they were doing kind of everything. But this was an early design for the Annapolis State House. And this design, this tower, this monopteral sort of dome on the top, had other connotations of power. There's a story or documentation of Jefferson and Madison going and visiting the governor of Maryland at the time. And they apparently spent like 3 hours up in that tower gossiping about the people in the town. They were just up there talking everything from philosophy and politics and stuff, and also talking about the town. And there has been work to show that the early sort of urban design in the US, and these towers with circular views, are panopticons, or they're an architectural style or landscape design that creates power and reinforces power on the landscape. And at Montpelier we have that too, to a certain degree. Overseers' houses, there's been papers about overseers' houses at other plantations where they were specifically set up in relation to slave quarters to create panopticons. So we're not sure if that's going on, but we do know view sheds were part of the design of the overseer's house, and the temple itself has a view of the ice pond and other working structures and stuff across the way that's downhill. So that might have been a place for Madison and guests to go and look out at labor practices as well, as sort of exercising their power and symbolizing their power. Again, so in the American context, temples have a whole nother symbolism in the 18th century. Peel, the same person who was behind the design of the Annapolis State House Tower, had on his own property a similar monopteral temple, but he had also designed this parade float, the grand edifice. I can't remember the original. There were 2 different names for it. It was like the Temple to the Immigrants or something like that, or the Federal Grand Edifice. And it was meant to be marched in these parades celebrating the signing of the Constitution and celebrating independence for the American colonies in the United States. And it has a Lady Liberty with a cornucopia on top. It's got 13 pillars. This one has one missing. It's symbolizing there was a uncertainty about some states signing on to the Constitution. And in documents, I have this book that really influenced. It talks about temple symbols in the early Republic. They were often surrounded by immigrants or even enslaved individuals, like people depicting enslaved individuals, sort of symbolizing the inclusivity of liberty. And the Constitution, or the temple itself, was representing the new nation, the new government, and the Constitution itself, and the ideals behind it, including liberty, which just like today, like we have debates about liberty, this goes back to this time, and oftentimes, as we will see, was centered around temples, and temples were used in that. The original design for the temple, at least potentially the original design, was done on this watercolor before it was built, and you can kind of tell. It's very hard to see because of the way the framing of the painting was, but there was a statue that may have been intended to be on top that could have been a Lady Liberty, as it was pretty common at the time in U.S. symbolism. But Jen Glass, our architectural preservationist and historian, when they were doing analysis ahead, they found no evidence that there was such a statue ever affixed to it. So it may have just been purely intention, or at some point, and it wasn't considered practical, or maybe Madison didn't want to do that to make the overt symbolism related to liberty that clear. Within Madison's personal life, there are, so this is a sort of key or token pendant sort of thing worn by students in, I think it was a debate, oh man, it's been a while, but it was in a group at his university who wore this pendant after the time he was there. It wasn't part of his sort of group, it was another group, but there is a tendency to also associate temples with universities, with education, with Enlightenment ideas beyond liberty. There's a letter from Madison to Jefferson, which he uses temple as a metaphor for universities, or education itself being a path to liberty. And in that context, he's probably speaking about liberty of the mind, that you're educated and you're sort of opening your mind to through science exploration and learning. But it is interesting that it kind of takes on these multiple meanings, from just garden, like I mentioned, garden temples, to symbols of power, to education itself, and they're all linked. Their temples also appear pretty frequently in Masonic imagery. So I've pictured 3 different aprons that Masons they wear when I guess they become Master Masons. There are a lot of different types of temples, everything from like square, sort of really Greek-looking temples, to pyramids, to the monopteros type that we see at Montpellier. There's no good evidence, and Hillary, our historian, has gone into this, that Madison was a Freemason, but that he was friends with Masons. He participated in a Masonic ceremony at one point. But a lot of the ideas that we just talked about, the sort of Enlightenment ideas, this idea of fraternity, or community through skills, through education, and building something. So like building the Constitution, building the new nation, there is a lot of mixing of similar types of symbolism, and that's temples are often seen as this kind of pinnacle of the construction of those ideals. There is a historian who claimed that all of those examples I showed earlier from England and France were built by people trying to show that they were Masons, which there's debate around it, but she wrote a whole book on it. I can send that the link to that, if anyone's particularly interested. It's not far-fetched or anything, but what's more likely though, and pervasive, is the temple being a symbol of liberty in United States iconography. It is often paired with Lady Liberty, which you can see centered here, eagles, stars which also take on connotations of liberty, and something called the Phrygian cap, or Liberty cap. It was given to Roman slaves usually as a symbol of them being emancipated or freed. And oftentimes Lady Liberty is either wearing a Phrygian cap or she has a spear with the Phrygian cap on it. And this symbolism is not lost on the common people of the time. There is a lot of hypocrisy recognized in liberty symbols, particularly ones involved with slavery, and temples becoming representative of the new nation when the new nation is declining or refusing to offer liberty to everyone, as that individual Charles Peel hadn't maybe intended with his Temple of the Immigrants, which was supposed to be more of an inclusive liberty. On the left here, there's it was a cover to a play that was written where this slave trader realizes the error of his ways, and he's I think asking for in the book they talk about he's asking for forgiveness from Lady Liberty, and she's at the foot of her temple, and you see enslaved individuals in the background and various other accoutrements associated with enlightenment and learning and sort of liberty of the mind there. So this play and plays of this type, in which Lady Liberty and her temple are often performed during those very same parades that the Grand Federal Edifice, that Liberty float I showed, or that temple float I showed you, there were often street plays. So these were going on as a sort of political act, a way of expressing maybe dissatisfaction. And in the early days, even after in like the 1780s, African Americans were participating in these parades on the sidelines. They weren't allowed to be in the march itself, but they were participating sometimes in these plays. And again, I got this information from this book, so I definitely recommend checking out. It's called Performing the Temple of Liberty. On the right here, we have the same sort of imagery being used by Wollstonecraft, who was a sort of early, proto-feminist suffragist who wanted rights and the same sort of ideas of liberty to be extended to women. And this is on the other side of the pond, so in England. So that we have these symbols being pretty ubiquitous. I only picked some examples. This is another trope of the time that, again, through learning and education, the enslaved are coming to the foot of the Temple of Liberty, where they're going to be freed. You see the Phrygian Liberty cap here, and Lady Liberty. And temples themselves are being used as a centerpiece in even on the political stage. So this is a political comment that's kind of a commentary on the fugitive slave law. And you can see, again, the temple is being featured here, pretty center place. I'm not going to go, you can read on the Library of Congress website more about, they do an analysis of each of the individuals represented in here and kind of what their representations mean, and you can look that up. But it's not just sort of cursory, that this symbol as a symbol around the issue of slavery and the Constitution and liberty and what it means is not just fringe movements amongst abolitionists and women's suffragists. It's appearing in political commentary. I'm sorry that this picture is so blurry. I reached out to people for a better picture, but on the right here, there's a transferware plate, and in the center you have a temple in the background, and there's a bunch of individuals from British colonies going to the British version of Lady Liberty. I forget the name for her. There's like several different names, from like Columbia, Liberty, there's some other ones as well, where she's usually depicted with a shield and like a Roman hat, a Roman helm, but they're coming to her to be bequeathed liberty. And it's a commentary on the British Empire and how they're they're not extending liberty to their empire despite kind of refusing those ideas. It even reaches this debate about the symbol of the temple. It's after the temple was built at Montpelier, but still you have liberty symbolism being debated in the architectural design of our nation's capital and its architecture. Jefferson Davis, who, as you all probably know, became the president of the Confederacy. He was, I believe, a senator beforehand, and he was charged with overseeing updates to the architecture and infrastructure of DC in the 1850s, early 1850s. I believe it might have been late 1840s, but I'm pretty sure it was 50s. And they contracted with an Italian artist to they wanted to build this monopteral, or a thoros rather. You can see it's got a central chamber that was going to be placed atop the Capitol building, and then there was going to be a Lady Liberty put atop it, and they wanted a statue of Lady Liberty. And the symbol, the accoutrement symbols to Lady Liberty have meaning. And the first design, which you can see here on the left, has her with a crown, a shield, which is, she's not in active defense or anything, but she has the Phrygian Liberty cap on. And Jefferson Davis was infuriated by this. He was worried that by putting that on the U.S. Capitol building, that it would be a symbol to every individual enslaved in the United States would see it as a comment to slavery, and that they would have a claim to be included in the House of Liberty, be included to have the same rights to freedoms that Davis and other, white elites and planters did not want to share, that were paranoid and worried about expanding those rights too. So after two more iterations, which is you see on the right, which is how it is still today, there is no Phrygian Liberty cap present at all. And there's a reason behind that. It's because they didn't want to include enslaved people in the House of Liberty, or at least show it outwardly. So that's kind of it continues on though. You've got, back a couple slides. How am I doing on time? Okay. This was from the 18th century on the left here, where it's supposed to show a bunch of, people in the United States, all white men of different backgrounds. They're not all elites, and they're all being included in the House of Liberty. It was that specific image was a sort of, it was a carving that was being used on everything from postcards to political pamphlets. You'll see it again later in my presentation. This was a pamphlet or propaganda that was being pushed out by the Union to try to recruit people for the cause there. And they've included an enslaved individual who's been freed, at least that's how they're being depicted, into liberty. And there's, Union soldiers and working class individuals there too. Again, all men. And then, here's more of it. The sort of end of the Civil War, this kind of jubilation of, the South and the North coming together at the foot of the Temple of Liberty to, free the enslaved. And you've got an individual here who's celebrating this enslaved individual who's still in chains in this image, but yeah. So this is mainstream iconography that people were familiar with, people were using to support their own claims. I think I skipped over something key here. Frederick Douglass, he was writing about the failed escape attempt on the Pearl, which Paul Jennings was involved with. I'm sure you all are familiar with Paul Jennings, who was enslaved at Montpelier. He was Madison's personal, quote unquote, body slave, or personal manslave, as often they're referred to in the documents. And he uses, this is only one example, he uses the temple capitalized multiple times in his writings metaphorically to refer to the nation. And he talks in this quote about the irony of the enslaved needing to run from the temple of liberty. Like, it's supposed to be this symbol of freedom, and yet they have to escape it. So it's pretty mainstream. But how does that all relate to Montpelier? And before I do that, does anyone have any questions or comments about anything I've discussed so far?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, I think we know that President Madison studied classical texts, Greek and Roman and other ancient texts when he was a student and at other points during his life. And apparently was quite interested in them.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering if it's possible that the temple, which is a classical type structure that was that's there, may have reflected a number of ideas that he may have had with respect to classical culture.
Definitely.
I mean, ancient classical culture. Liberty would be, one concept that, democracy, political systems, or the formation of political systems and different types of ideas about lawmaking. And I'm just wondering.
You're exactly
sorry,
right.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. You are right that I didn't really say it explicitly, but the idea of like enlightenment, the way a lot of these individuals were reaching enlightenment was through exposure and the study of the greats, or the classic greats, through their ideas of governance, philosophy, science, and implementing those into a new nation. And temples have that sort of symbolism. That's why you see groups like the Freemasons, who also are dedicated to some of those ideas, using them as central symbols too. There have been past employees at Montpelier and architectural historians who thought that the temple was specifically a replica of the Temple of Vesta, which is a Thoros type temple, where it's got the central chamber. But there's so many other examples at the time, since that original idea of the Temple of Vesta, and it being sort of housing the flame of liberty, or the flame of democracy, I think, at least in the ancient text, I think that's what they refer to it as. There's been
flame of the hearth.
Hearth. There have been so many other examples in contemporary types of temples that they don't all trace back to that one example. Even during Roman times and Greek times, there were lots of other temples. And I guess this type of temple in general, they often had a statue either within it or atop it. And it was a place of, it was a miniature temple, like you would think of a church or something, where it's symbolizing the ideas of that god or goddess. So a lot of those aristocrats in England and France, they're naming their temples things like the Temple of Venus, or the Temple of Love, or Temples of Liberty. They're mimicking the sort of style that you're talking about, from their study and their understanding of the classics, which is seen, in the resurgence in Palladian style architecture that Jefferson is often accredited to bringing to the United States, to the way they're building their libraries. They're trying to signal to others. They're not just doing it as signaling, but it does, what they put on their bookshelves, their artistic designs, their artistic influences do communicate the ideas they want people to see in themselves. So in that way, the temple is part of Madison's personal identity construction. Like, he is building who he is, and that is someone who is informed about these ancient ideals, and he's educated, and he's, it has very prominent connotations of the new government, there is a, when I was doing research into Madison's letters, there was an exchange between, I don't know who the guy was, but they kept talking about the temple. I think there was a speech that Madison gave too, where he refers to Congress as the temple, as well. But there's just so many examples. I've been trying to. That was a long answer to your question, but yes, you're exactly right. There are multiple ideas, and some of them, one component of that is the classical influence. Sorry, I was meandering. Great question, Dean.
Thank you.
Cool. So one of the things, I can't just say, like, return to Montpelier and say every member of the enslaved community was absolutely, definitely familiar with every single aspect of those symbols that I was just talking about. It is very likely that they are familiar with it, because it is so prevalent, that they are all enslaved by the president, who, and some of them are spending time in DC. And there is a example from the 18th century where Madison brought an enslaved individual with him to Philadelphia, and he specifically sold. I don't think I included the quote in my presentation. He sold off or freed that individual because he didn't want him returning to the plantation and bringing back ideas of liberty, or he I think he referred to him as being tainted, because that was a fear. You didn't want emancipatory ideas to be spread amongst other enslaved individuals. And at that time, when he was there in the 1780s, that's when all those parades were going on, when there's that I was talking about, when African Americans were participating to a degree in those parades. You have a rise in Black fraternal organizations, including the Freemasons and other organizations. There's a historian, Ira Berlin, who talks about this as well. And they are using these symbols to specifically comment on ideas of liberty and as a critique of slavery, independently and in unison with the same conversation that's happening at the national scale. So there are opportunities for members of the enslaved community at Montpelier to be encountering these ideas, whether it's from their time in DC, whether it's from other enslaved individuals accompanying their enslaver when they're visiting Montpelier, whether it's Jefferson or you know, name any of them who are coming there for the parties, that they're usually often bringing enslaved peoples with them too. And it poses an opportunity for the spread of those ideas. Probably the most common artifact, since we don't have a specific, well, we do, but the most common artifact that we do find at Montpelier, and what would have been pervasive in terms of imagery, is coinage. We all know our coinage today has lots of symbols on it specifically related to liberty symbols, and so this often we'll call this a liberty coin. It's got liberty in all caps, huge letters. There's Lady Liberty on it with that Phrygian cap on a spear. Sometimes she's wearing it, sometimes she's not. Sometimes it's on the reverse of the coin by itself with like a sunburst around it, or it's got stars around it. Terry in his dissertation, or I can't remember if it was your dissertation or upcoming article or both, there's an example of a Liberty coin that was found at a plantation in Southern Maryland that is a pierced coin that has a Phrygian cap on it. And none of our examples here are pierced, but they are found in enslaved contexts and or near enslaved contexts. And we do know members of the enslaved community had sums of money that they were using to purchase items with. And that's something that I'm sure you all have been familiar with from a lot of other presentations that Mary and others have given here. The most, I guess, famous of which at Montpelier is the Liberty pipe. It literally has Lady Liberty on it, and she's wearing a cap, and it has the words Liberty on it. And it was something that was owned. It was found in an enslaved context and was probably owned by an enslaved individual. And Terry has several blog posts about it. And we also have a Masonic pipe, which isn't, explicitly related to liberty, but it does have, like I mentioned, it is tied to, and Terry talks about this too in his blog post. It's tied to Black fraternal orders, which are often organized around the same sort of ideals in many ways that white fraternal orders are, which include liberty of the mind, education, sort of commonality. They kind of hearken to that picture of sort of equalizing every working man, no matter their rank in that society, as being equals in the house of liberty. So there's an appeal. Freemasonry has that, and there's also John Walker. Is that his name, Terry? John Walker's appeal. I can't hear you.
David Walker.
David Walker. Thank you.
David Walker.
Which is a emancipatory call for emancipation. We know from historic documentation that those are on and circulating through plantations in the South. So although this Masonic pipe isn't necessarily 100% tied to liberty symbolism, it does have potential connotations. Buttons are, you've all come to the South Yard, and buttons are very diverse in enslaved contexts. They are yet another example of individuality, identity creation amongst individuals in the enslaved community. There is this one button here that was found in the field slave quarters that has a cider barrel on it. And it is a political button that was being tied towards William Harrison's campaign for presidency. He used several symbols as part of his campaign, one of which was the working man, frontierman idea. Harrison was a slave owner who had sort of mixed, like Madison, he had mixed statements on slavery, and sometimes he would say things that made him sound like he was against it, and other times he wasn't, because he was also a slave owner. But there was this pamphlet found, or this pamphlet was handed out at Richmond during one of his rallies, his campaign rallies, which has a working man sitting on a cider barrel. It's hard to see by a log cabin. There's a sort of the Virginia emblem here, and then that same motif I mentioned before of the all these individuals under the Temple of Liberty. So whether this pamphlet, these ideas and the combination of these symbols may have been something that the enslaved individual who had this button and wore this button was familiar with. It's possible that they wore this button just because of the working man connotations, which also unifies with Freemason ideas and connotations and those symbols. But it might have been something, they might have seen or heard something similar to the ideals of liberty and, equality and working men. And this cider barrel button was symbolic of that. But you'll notice all these examples I pulled from, they're just from various parts of the plantation. They're symbolic artifacts, and none of them relate explicitly to the temple necessarily. But they're all things that can inform and tell us about the worldviews of the individuals wearing them as they're approaching the temple and engaging in liberty or in labor there. Something that's a little tricky is in pottery. I pulled several sets that were found at Montpelier. I haven't done deep analysis of the prevalence of these sets in terms of numbers. It would have just the amount of stuff I was going through for my thesis, I did not have time. And I would have had to do a lot more data cleaning, as some of you probably saw from Hannah's talk last week, which was amazing. But garden follies, specifically temple-like structures, are appearing in enslaved contexts explicitly. Now, what that means is not easy to read. And I've played with a lot of different ideas. And, you know, the main thing is that, as Mary talked about a couple years ago with the Tear for Poland pattern and some of her other patterns, is that the intended meaning of the motif by the creators or the intended consumer is not necessarily what the consumer reads in that art design that's on that vessel. That you have these, you know, you've got little follies in here, and they might just be examples of a pretty, it's supposed to be intended as a aesthetically pleasing landscape design that is, you know, for the common consumer, is supposed to appeal to everyone for different reasons, or maybe the same reason, that it's just pretty. But for an enslaved individual owning these plates, choosing to purchase them, or other forms, they might mean different things. They might symbolize a temple being sort of trapped on the plantation. This Temple of Liberty is trapped on the plantation just like they are. It could just simply be, this looks like the home I live in. I think it's pretty too. It could symbolize the fars. Often, let me see, I think there's a example here. This is actually a Tear for Poland. In the background, there is a temple-like structure here. It could show this sort of far off symbol of liberty that is not easily attained to you. Again, it's trapped on the plantation, but it's far away. You can't actually reach it. So all, you know, that kind of throws into light, or makes us think a little bit different how each individual, enslaved individual, is thinking about this structure as they're approaching it, whether they're loading ice into it, whether they're going down there to gather some ice to bring out to make some ice cream, whether they're standing there silently, waiting on, you know, Dolly Madison while she's entertaining guests. They are probably aware of the meanings of this structure, and it's a looming reminder of what they don't have, yet they're there, and they're laboring there, and often physically below it, and often hidden and silent. So there's no folly in this one, but I included it because I'll just breeze over it. But let's see. I guess I'll wrap up briefly with the sort of tale of the ice house wager. There's this story that starts in the 19th century, at least from the written examples from the late 19th century. It's an oral tradition that has sort of continued on into the 20th century. The story of Madison having a wager with an enslaved person, an enslaved man, who doesn't believe that the ice house will be able to keep the ice frozen through the year. And they have a wager for a Christmas turkey, or, you know, in exchange for a mint julep or an iced julep. And Madison, of course, wins. And I think I talked about this last time in the context of Madison being the bequeather of scientific knowledge and control over nature and the landscape, something that he is imparting on the enslaved. And I talked about how that is not accurate. The enslaved were using ice for their own purposes too, and other countries that are not Western and white were using it. But over time, the wager, the characters in the wager change a little bit. It transforms from an enslaved man to Paul Jennings to an overseer, and the overseer has no explicit race, but overseers, at least in the 20th century, we often assume in our mindset that they're white, that they're like a poor white working class individual. Not, although it's not true that they weren't enslaved, there were enslaved overseers, but in this context, the race and status of the person involved in this wager is changing. And it's interesting. It tells the story through the way that we remember a place. It's telling how we are actively erasing a group of people from a place. And with that, we not only erased, you know, the labor involved with that landscape. So we're removing enslaved people from the landscape. We've also forgotten how that structure itself symbolize, you know, the irony that is inherent to a liberty symbol on the plantation being created by, labored around by people who are not included in that house of liberty, in that temple of liberty. So it's easier for us to forget, and it's easier for us to see it as a pristine and white place. And I hope that through this two-part, 1 hour each lecture, that you all maybe that I've shown or sort of restored those stories, or at least show that there's a lot we can still do to question all of those spaces that we assume are like this, and critique the stories that we think we know. And if you haven't read it yet, I should include it, but Hillary wrote, Terry can probably throw it in a link in the chat, or I can, about the 300 enslaved people at Montpelier who built Madison's wealth, and in many ways, like every other enslaved individual, built our nation. They built Washington, D.C., and yet they weren't included in it for a very long time, and still we're fighting for that today. And the temple is no exception to that rule. So that is all. I probably missed a bunch of stuff, but we already went over an hour. So if you all have any more questions, I'm here to answer them, or you can email me individually or whatever.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks.
By the way, if you have questions, y'all.
I was going to say thank you, Chris. It was so interesting to see, you know, all the details about the images of liberty, but also to hear about Jefferson Davis's involvement in the architecture of the Capitol. It's fascinating. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. That blew my mind too. I had no idea until I got into it.
It's wild. Thank you. It's really great.
You. I appreciate it. Thanks, Taylor.
Yeah,
Is there a way to read your thesis? Is there a link to your thesis, or?
I can throw that. I can email it to you. I can throw a link in as well. I don't have it's on my Google Drive. I don't know what's the best way for you to have it. Would you rather have a PDF of it or the Google Drive?
If you
Chris, now that it's done, we should
a PDF or something.
Okay.
Now that it's done, we can put it on the Digital Doorway website in the reports and publications section. So
cool.
That'll be easier for everyone to access that way.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
It is not a small PDF.
No, it's not. Well, I appreciate you all coming to this. And if you ever have any more questions, or you come across anything that is discussing slavery and liberties and temples, or anything from Montpelier or other plantation examples, please send it to me. I will probably forever be interested in this topic, and like anything, will never really stop. So, again,
and other people are thinking about the temple in this way. I don't know if any of you have read Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, his recent book about fiction, or it is a fiction book. It's not about fiction. It is fiction. But he visited Montpelier when he was working on that novel, and the temple is in it. and it is in it as a space where two African Americans sit underneath it and get drunk underneath it late at night, having their own moment and their own conversation. And we always think about that temple as a space where the Madisons would have sat and had drinks and things like that. And it's but it's just this other way of thinking about it. And it's what I think Chris's research does so well is really help us think about the temple and the ice house as a space that's on this plantation that was accessed and looked at and viewed by everybody at Montpelier and had meaning for everyone who visited and everyone who lived there and everyone who was enslaved there. And so it's really important work and ways that we look at everything that we do at Montpelier. So thanks, Chris, for sharing that all with us. And with that, I think we will wrap up, and we will be in touch with what all the other upcoming lunch and learns are going to be as we get them scheduled, and we'll also be in touch with the Zoom links that work. So we won't be a little panicked getting everyone attached at the beginning. So anyway, thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you all. Enjoy your day.